Chapter 21. As Huan gazed upon the blind girl, with the little ones grouped around her knees, he longed to fold her in his arms, and have, in the sweet assurance of the embrace, thrilling proof that she still was spared to him. And, when the king and chiefs and little ones and all had gone, and Huan was left alone with Anthe, he threw himself upon her neck and thanked heaven for its many blessings, but for the blessing of his sister's life above them all. Then she told him of all her sufferings, and he of all his struggling to relieve her. And, while pity strengthened the love of the one, gratitude gave a double earnestness to the affection of the other. As they each ran over to the other the peaceful triumphs they had gained, Anthe besought Huan that he would make that happy land their resting place, so that they themselves might watch over the goodly work they had begun. But the dwarf reminded her that before they gave to strangers they should first satisfy the wants of home. And he asked her whether she were so bleat that none who claimed kindred with her stood in need of her charity. Anthe saw the meaning of her brother's words. And, remembering her father's sufferings, bade Huan take her back to him at once. Now when it was known among the people that their good friends were about to depart, little groups of men, women, and children would collect in the cool of the evening, around the hut, and, sitting beneath the shade of a stately banana tree, would sing in plaintive tones the rude verses they had made to express their sorrow at the parting, while others would bring their mats and sleep on them beneath Huan's and his sister's windows, in order to be near them, so that the first sounds Anthe and her brother heard, as the east grew crimson with the rising sun, was the plaintive farewell hymn mingled with the voices of the birds. And when at last the day of departure came, thousands went with the kindly couple to the beach, where a feast was spread, that they might break bread in peace before they parted. On their way thither, both sides of the path were lined with the multitude who had come to crave a blessing ere they left them forever. And, as Huan and Anthe walked along and looked upon the altered people, they smiled with joy to think how different was their parting from their meeting. The warfield in the distance, which for ages had been left barren for the fight, was here brown with the new-turned earth, and there green with the coming crop. And men sat in the shade beside their doors, on chairs of their own making, with their wives and daughters next them, plying the needle or busy at the spinning wheel. The clanking of the loom and the ring of the anvil ceased, as Huan and Anthe advanced, and the chieftain, who now plied the shuttle, left the web, and the blacksmith, once a noted warrior, came from the forge, with bare and brawny arms, to shake the hand that had taught them their peaceful arts. Then, as they neared the village, girls came running from the churn and men from the plough, to swell the train, while those who once had been priestesses to the god of war, now came forth, knitting on their way, to join the throng. Next, the splashing of the water and the drone of the wheel of the sugar mill was stopped, and the whir of the turning lathe ceased, and the priest, who was now the printer, left off working at the press, and all flocked out to implore a blessing on the heads of those who had come in kindness to teach them how to serve God, their neighbor, and themselves. Then, as they passed the schools, the old and the young marched forth to greet them. Here was a gray-haired chieftain that, in his old age, had come to learn, and he had, slung round his neck, a chip, a magic one, he thought, on which a hasty message had been written, and, as he danced along, he cried, "See the wisdom of these strangers. They can make even the wood talk to people at a distance." There was another, as old and simple as the last, who, to bless the blind girl and her brother as they went by, muttered his new learned alphabet as a fancied prayer. And when the shore was reached and the feast was ended, the king rose up and said, "It is my wish that all who are now assembled promise our brother and our sister, the best friends we ever knew, that the good work they have begun shall not be put aside when they are far away. When they first came among us we thought them driftwood cast on shore by the waves of the ocean, but see what they have taught us. Let us think of what we are and what we were. Our bodies are now covered all over with beautiful cloth, while formerly we had nothing but a girdle of leaves around our waist. Now our very feet are clothed, and a little while since they were like the dogs. Formerly we were obliged to work with our axes of stone, day by day, before we could cut down a single tree. Now we have axes so hard and sharp that the trees are like reeds before us. Before they came among us we used human bones to dig and make our canoes with, now we have tools so hard and sharp, that we cut through the wood and the ground as though they were water. Our knives, too, what valuable things are they! How quickly they cut up our swine, compared with our bamboo ones of old. Our women have no need to go down to the water to look at themselves, because now they have small shining things in which they can see their fares as plainly as we can see one another. And our children no longer cry and scream to have their hair cut, now that it is done with scissors instead of shark's teeth. Now, when I look at the wisdom of these people, and see how superior they are to us, and how superior they have made us to what we were, I say again, it is my wish that their God should be our God forever and ever. Then, as husband his sister rose with tearful eyes, to bid them all Godspeed. Vars, who had been the first to learn to pray, ran towards the dwarf, and, throwing himself at his feet, wept bitterly. And, as he knelt and lifted his clasped hands to heaven, the whole multitude knelt also, while Vars cried aloud, O God, tell the winds about them, that they may not blow fiercely upon them. Command the ocean concerning them, that it may not swallow them up. Conduct them in safety to their far distant country, and give them a happy meeting with their friends, and then, conduct them back again to us. I have seen, O Lord, a compass in their vessel, by which the shipmen steer the right path. Do Thou, in their absence, be our compass, to direct us in the right course, that we may escape the rocks and quicksands in our way. Be to us, O Lord, the compass of everlasting life. Then, as Huan and Anthe tore themselves away from the grateful people, and the boat left the shore and floated past the sloping banks of white and red coral that shone at the bottom of the placid and transparent waters, like a flower garden beneath the sea, the people sang with one voice and one heart, Blessing on you, kindly friends. Blessing on you, in your journey across the deep. Now the 1,000 voices were hushed, while 1,000 hands were waved towards them. Now the same loving song broke forth again, growing fainter and fainter, as the waves went dancing by the boat. Till it was heard only as the breeze came rippling over the crystal waters, and then it was lost forever in the distance. Chapter 22. Aleph and his band had long since returned to Asulan, to tell the wondrous story of the nation that had been conquered without the shedding of one drop of blood. And when it was spread about that Huan and his sister were returning, Ulfilas and his court went out to meet them, and bid them welcome, as the greatest glory of the land. And the monarch set apart for Anthe and her brother the noblest chambers in his palace. Then, as the evening drew in, he made Huan and his sister go over and over again the many marvels they had wrought, and the mighty warrior, who had conquered half the earth by the resistless sway of his arms, cried, as he listened to the tale, Verily, there are but two powers in the world, kindness and the sword, and, in the end, kindness is sure to subdue the sword, for there is no force so overwhelming as that whose strength lies in its very weakness. But Huan, smiling, answered, he feared the king had not yet perfect faith in the magic of the kindly influence. Then the monarch called heaven to witness, that he believed there were no limits to its power over man. Instantly Huan bade him prove his words, and free the maniac of his chains. But Ulfilas sought to qualify the speech, and answered, that man was only man by the possession of his reason, and, when that left him, he was as the beasts of the field. Whereupon Huan replied, that it was the province of the reason to think and not to feel, and kindness, he told the king a second time, spake to the heart and not to the head. As Huan saw the king waver, he again urged Ulfilas that he would allow him to unchain the maniacs. And he pleaded for their liberty with such earnestness and warmth, that the monarch at length gave way to his arguments, and agreed to go with the dwarf and visit the maniac's dungeons in the morning. Anthe and her brother could scarcely sleep that night, for the joy they felt. At last their prayer had been heard, and their father would be free on the morrow. Early the next day, Huan and Anthe led the king to the grim abode. As they entered, they found the sufferers chained naked to the walls and being shown for money, like wild beasts, to gaping visitors, while the keepers, so that the rage of the poor frantic wretches might be increased for the amusement of the sightseers, alluded to every subject likely to excite their fury. The Voracious Idiot, too, was kept without food, so that his unnatural gluttony might appear the more wonderful to the wonder-seeking crowd. But when Ulfilas saw the fury of those that were chained, and heard the confused sound of their cries, shrieks, laughter and curses, and, above all, the clanking of the iron fetters in the damp and dark cells, he repented him of what he had said, and hurried from the place, exclaiming, You will become the victim of their rage and your own rashness. Your blood be upon your own head. And, now that the time had come, even Huan himself half trembled for the result, and he bade Anthe leave him, so that he alone might meet the danger. But the loving girl clung the closer to him, and, as his faith wavered under the heavy trial, hers grew the stronger for it, and she reminded him how kindness had tamed the beast of the field and the savage of the forest, and she bade him still trust the magic power that had triumphed when all others had failed. But again Huan heard the fury in the shrieks, and his spirit quailed before them. So he prayed for strength, saying, Almighty Spirit of kindness, help me, oh help me. In this the greatest work of all. Show, to those who want faith in the magic of thy power, that even the maniac, deprived of every other means of intercourse with man, is still able to understand thy gentle voice, and be guided by thy tender hand. Then, as he felt his confidence come back, he turned to those about him, and bade them lead him to Ergaster's cell. But they dared not, saying, Ergaster's fury made him the most dangerous of all. So they besought him to begin the perilous trial upon those whom long confinement had rendered almost powerless, and Huan, yielding to their entreaties, moved towards the first cell. In it was one who had been in chains for 40 years, and who had been so long hidden from the world that no one knew his history. The keepers approached him with caution, for in a fit of rabid rage he had killed one of them with a blow from his manacles. His chains were heavier, stronger, and tighter than the rest. Huan entered the dark dungeon, and, speaking to the maniac in a calm, kind voice, told him he had come to free him of his fetters, but the madman laughed scornfully, as he said, No. 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 You are all too much afraid of me. But the dauntless Huan advanced, and smote the chains with the magic branch, and instantly the links burst like bubbles at the touch. Then Anthe and the dwarf drew back from the cell, leaving open the heavily barred door. The poor wretch raised himself many times from his seat, and as many times sank down again. He had been so long chained to his chair, that his legs bent under him as he tried to use them. At last he stood up, and with tottering steps reached the door of his dark dungeon. His first look was at the blue sky, that he had not gazed upon for 40 years, and, as he drank in the sweet air, and felt the soft refreshing breeze fan his burning brain, he cried out, as his lip quivered with emotion, and his eye filled with tears, Great God! How beautiful! Then the poor wretch staggered into the sunshine, and stood still to listen to the chirping of the birds. And then he hurried back into the cool shade again, and gazed wildly upon the green trees, all the time uttering quickly, as he went, How beautiful! Great God, how beautiful! In the next cell that Huan visited was one who had not stirred from it for 10 years. He had been a soldier, but drink had driven him mad. In his frenzy he believed himself a general, and attacked all that would not bow to his rank, and he was more dangerous than all, from his greater bodily strength, for he had often, in his fury, snapped his chains with his hands only. Once he had broken loose, and then had defied his keepers to enter his cell, till they had passed under his legs. Nor could he be quieted, until 8 of the boldest had obeyed his strange command. One wave of the branch, and the maniac giant was unchained, with the dwarf unarmed and alone beside him. But the change was sudden and complete. No sooner was the madman free, than he became gentle and devoted as a child. With his eye he followed every motion of the dwarf. And when Huan called upon him to help him release his fellow prisoners from their chains, he joyfully obeyed, speaking kindly and even reasonably to his brothers in affliction. And so earnest was the attachment of the madman to his deliverer, and all that belonged to him, that when years had gone by, and the hand that had freed him was moldering in the dust, he still followed and tended so faithfully those that claimed kindred with his liberator, that they could not hear without emotion the mention of his name. In the cell adjoining this one were 3 strangers in the land. They had been in chains for many years, but why, no one knew. They were calm and harmless, becoming animated solely when conversing in their own language, which none about them could understand. They were allowed, the only consolation of which they seemed sensible, to live together. As Huan entered to release them, they became alarmed, for they fancied he had come to inflict new tortures on them, and they warned him by their gestures not to approach. In vain did Huan wave the magic branch, for though the chains fell heavily from the poor creature's limbs, still they would not quit the seat that many years of bondage had used them to. Either grief or loss of intellect had rendered them indifferent to liberty, and the earth had no fairer spot for them than the dark and damp dungeon to which their chains so long had bound them. And, now that Huan had shown to the few that, wondering, followed him, how kindness still held sway over those upon whom reason had lost all power, he asked the keepers whether they yet had courage to take him to his father's cell. When they had led him there and unbarred the door, they fled in fear. As Huan forced back the heavy, creaking mass of iron, his heart bled to look upon the awful spectacle before him, and he shuddered to behold the iron vices that gripped the old man's limbs. In his ravings, Ergaster, had struck the doctor of the house, and either from fear or as a punishment, a new and most ingenious instrument of torture had been invented for his confinement. A neck ring of stout iron was riveted round his throat, and from it was a heavy chain that bound him to a bar at his back, which was fastened in the wall. Round his body a strong iron girdle was clamped, with iron armlets welded on each side, and through these the old man's arms were passed and held close pinioned to his body. Over his shoulders were 2 thick iron braces, with their ends screwed to the girdle, so that the poor wretch might not lift his arms and draw them through the iron belts that gripped them to his waist. These braces, again, were fastened by a double link to the iron collar, while from all ran chains, bolted to the bar against the wall. His right leg, too, was chained to the trough in which he was encased, and which served him for chair, bed, home, world, and all, and, though the chains which held him to the bar at his back slid up and down the iron post, still the wretched creature could neither stand upright nor lie down at ease. One touch of the branch, and the iron belts and bands snapped like threads. But the freedom came too late, for the arms of the poor maniac still pressed as close as ever to his sides. Not a limb did he move in token of the liberty that had at last been given, but he sat as though he were still manacled, and his muscles had become as rigid as the iron that so long had bound them. Anthe flew to her father's side and tried with gentle care to set his foot down on the stony floor, so that she might help him pass from his wretched dungeon into the pure air without. As she moved the stiffened limb, the old man shrieked with pain. Then Huan strove to lay him down, but the poor cramped creature shrieked more wildly than before as they tried to bend the muscles of his back. Anthe fell upon her knees, and, as she sobbed aloud, screamed, "Father! Father! Forgive me! Oh, forgive me!" But the old man moved not a muscle in reply, his glassy eye was still fixed with the same vacant stare. Again the blind girl called frantically upon her father for his forgiveness, but in vain, for the eyelid drooped, and the jaw fell, and the old man died in the same posture in which his chain so long had held him. And there sat the corpse, its back against the bar, its arms close pressed against its sides, as if its stiffened limbs had been the iron fetters of its soul, till kindness, taking pity on its wretched bondage, had freed the spirit of its fleshy chains, and let it fly, like an unwaged bird, to heaven. Huan dragged Anthe senseless from the awful scene. Then, with his sympathies for the sufferings of the maniacs made still more keen by the sufferings of his father, he cried aloud to the spirit of kindness that she would put an end to such atrocities forever. As he spoke the words, a magic change came over the dismal building, and the gloomy, barred and bolted prison became the cheerful and kindly asylum. The high, dark walls that had shut out the green fields of the earth and the golden light of heaven, sank, till the country round was seen in all its healthful verdure and soothing beauty. The bars dropped from before the narrow windows as if melted by the sunbeams that came streaming in, or swept away by the sweet air that now gushed through them. And, where the bars had frowned, birds in cages sang, and flowers blossomed, till the damp, dark dungeons that once had echoed with the clanking of chains and reeked with the fetid atmosphere, were now cheerful chambers, pleasant with melody and perfume. There was warmth for the winter, and coolness and shade for the summer. There were lightsome places set apart for the tranquil, the sick and the helpless, and places as lightsome, too, though more secure, for the unruly, the noisy and the violent. And those who for years had never moved a limb or had a peaceful thought, were now busy forgetting their delusions in the workshops and the workrooms, the farm and the dairy, the smithy, the printing office and the playground, that gave new life and health to the place. Those who, a little while back, would have been chained in wooden troughs, now made soft bedding for their suffering brethren. Those whose bodies would once have been strapped to the coercion chair, were now busy making easy seats for the feeble and the helpless. Those whose limbs would have been gripped fast by leg locks, were now hard at work tilling the sweet-smelling earth, while others, whose muscles would have been stiffened with iron belts and braces, fashioned toys and puzzles for the childish. Where the dismal yards and barren courts had stood, encompassed by their high and gloomy walls, without a tree, without a shrub, without a blade of grass, without shade in the heat of summer or shelter from the rains of winter, with the hard, stony soil worn into hollows from the restless feet that trod it, and the only luxury there, a bench fastened to the wall Dr. Cooley, on the construction and government of lunatic asylums. With massive iron rings above it, so that, even in the open air, force, instead of care, might rule the inmates. Now gardens bloomed instead, with shrubs and trees, to fling their cool, refreshing shade across the sunny paths for years to come, and fragrant summer houses, and seats in pleasant places, for the feeble and the imbecile to sit and warm their sluggish blood in the sun. And there were flower beds, prismatic with the colors of their many blossoms, and wide red gravel walks between rows of lime trees, and aviaries musical with birds, and cages alive with tame animals, for the maniac to foster and fondle, and be himself tamed in the kindly act. Here one madman might be seen, drawing after him a wheeled chair, in which his helpless brother sat drinking in the fragrant breeze. There was another, moody and lethargic, who had been tempted out by the kindly words of him on whose arm he rested. Some, like children, came running with the hoop, others stood still to play at battledore. Yonder was a noisy crew, sporting with fantastic mirth on the smooth bowling green, and, in sheltered corners, some rode the rocking horse, others forgot their follies over their ninepins, whilst others in the distance worked at the healthful farm. As the evening drew in, the walls which had formerly echoed only to the groans, shrieks, and ravings of their furious prisoners, now sounded cheerily with the music of flute, clarinet, and violin, played by hands that a little while back would have rattled the chain. And some sang plaintive ballads, and others merry songs, while, in the spacious hall below, hundreds danced together with quaint mirth, freely and fantastically as they pleased. And, when the hour of bedtime came, cheerful faces and grateful looks told how well the kindly treatment worked, while the wild dancers, with their limbs tired and weary with their sport, longed for the rest that formerly the maniac had seldom known. And, if even then they could not rest, there was ever, in the depth of the night, a kindly hand near them, to bathe their burning brow or moisten their parched lips with cooling drink. For, whereas before the cries of the restless only brought some savage keeper to strap them the tighter in their beds, now there came, in instant answer to their wants, a gentle hand, bearing some refreshing draught, or ready to make the bed afresh, or put a cool, clean dress upon the fevered limbs, and then, with a kind and cheerful good night, to leave the poor creatures at least calmed and grateful, if not to sleep. After this came the crowning work of all, wherein men, by the magic of kindness, were made to appear as gods, giving mind, and almost senses, to human creatures that seemed lower in intelligence than even the beasts of the field. The troubled brain had been composed, and the heart of the maniac tranquilized, but it yet remained for the spirit of kindness to show that by her wondrous power even the crushed intellect could be restored and the lost affections regained. Instantly, with a wave of the magic branch, the kindly tutor was seen seated in the maniac school, among his crazy and idiot scholars, like a father among his children, encouraging them, assisting them, directing them, and promoting all kinds of easy and pleasant mental exercises, that might by gentle efforts lead back again those powers by the loss of which all is lost that is worth preserving. The tranquility, the content, the cheerfulness of that little room, was a thing, to be remembered for all time. Now one poor maniac, whose wandering I still told the fever of his brain, stood up with cheerfulness, and recited a short poem, whilst those around, though as mad as he, listened attentively to all he said. Then the witless crew sang together, keeping time and harmony, without one to lead them whose senses were less disordered than their own, while the little band that accompanied them was played by creatures as crazy as the rest. Next they ranged themselves in mimic rank and file, while the youngest of the class, a little idiot boy of 5 years old, who a short while ago could scarcely move his torpid limbs, followed the rest, imitating the actions, holding out first his right arm, then the left, and marching now this way, now that, at the word of command, to the sound of a drum, beaten with all the lively skill of a soldier's hand, by another idiot, who strutted along, delighted with the drummer clothes he wore. And all this was done by a band of beings whose powers, both of mind and body, seemed the very despair of art, holding out such little hope of culture, that formerly the wretched, witless things would have been left to mope away their lives in uncared for indolence and apathy. But among these many wonders was seen the greatest wonder of the whole. There stood one who for many years had been an idiot in his intellect, his inclinations, and even his senses, a creature in utter discord with the human world without, signalized by a voracious, indiscriminate, gluttonous appetite, a hideous, insatiable craving, and a blind and terrible instinct of destruction. He was wholly an animal, without attachment, without tact, intelligence, power of attention, or sense of property or right. His eyes were never fixed, and seemed to act without his will. His taste was depraved, his touch obtuse, his ear scarcely recognized sounds, and he barely seemed to be possessed of the sense of smell. devouring everything, however disgusting, brutally sensual and passionate, breaking, tearing, destroying whatever he could lay his hands upon, and, if prevented, then pinching, biting and scratching himself, until he was covered with blood. He walked with difficulty, and could neither run, leap, nor exert the act of throwing. Sometimes he sprang like a leopard, and his sole delight was to strike one sonorous body against another, and, to put the last ghastly touch to the degrading picture, he was so attracted by the eyes of his brothers, sisters, and playfellows, as to be continually striving to push them out with his fingers. And now what a magic change had untiring care and loving kindness worked. There stood this same poor idiot boy, docile in his manners, decent in his habits, and capable, though not without some little effort, of directing his vague senses and wandering attention, so that his memory was stored with little knowledge, and he could tell the names of the simple objects and figures that surrounded him, while he had become affectionately conscious of the presence of his kindly teachers and friends. Redeemed from the constant dominion of the lowest animal propensities, with a few fragments of faculties that had been left him cultivated, and others even called into life, it was most affecting to see the poor little fellow come forward, and hear him sing his little ballad and recite his little prayer, to see him write as steadily and as well as most youths in his station of life, and watch him count by means of marbles or small pieces of wood. Sometimes, it is true, the poor half-witted lad would fail in his answers, but, soon encouraged by the kindly voice of his master, he would make a second effort, and rectify himself, the crowning glory of the marvel being that, whilst the senses, the muscular powers, and the intellect had received some culture, the habits had been improved, the propensities regulated, and play given to the affections, so that a wild, ungovernable animal, calculated to excite only fear, aversion or disgust, stood transformed by the wondrous magic of the spirit of kindness into the likeness and manners of a man. Chapter 23. Huan returned with Anthe to the palace, and entreated Evoe that she would watch over and console his poor stricken sister in her affliction. Then he bent his steps to the king, and besought him that he would come with him and see the change that had been worked. So Ulfilas, with Aleph and all his court, proceeded straightway to the madhouse. And when the king saw what kindness had done upon those whose hearts seemed closed to its influence, he turned to his courtiers and asked what reward should be given to the man that had wrought the marvel. The assembled nobles answered, that heaven alone could compensate him. The honors that man could bestow would only be a fraction of his due. Then Ulfilas called Huan to him, and implored him to remain forever by his side, so that he might profit by his counsels and learn to govern his people with the same kindly principles as he had used to govern the savage and the maniac. And he said, "According to thy word, all my people shall be ruled, and only on the throne will I be greater than thou. I will set thee over all the land, and even my own son shall be under thee." Now, when Aleph heard the speech, though he bowed in obedience to the command, still his heart swelled with wounded pride, and he looked in anger upon Huan. But when it was known throughout the nation that the good dwarf was to rule over them, the city grew merry with the news, and they feasted the hungry and clothed the naked, crying in their joy, "Now shall evil cease, and happiness alone reign in the land." Then Huan sent heralds throughout the country to cite the people to the city from far and near. And as the crowd that gathered round the trumpeted messengers heard the summons, they marveled at the meaning of it, and asked among themselves, "Why is our presence needed?" And when the wondering multitude had been assembled, Huan led them to a high mountain beyond the gates of the capital. Then he bade the people say whether they loved their neighbors as themselves, and immediately the hills echoed with 1,000,000 voices, and the heavens rang with one loud cry of "We do! We do!" Then, as Huan raised the magic branch above his head, there arose from the far-off sea a dewy mist, and as the sun behind them shone full upon it, there was seen in the skies the mirage of a distant land. And, pictured in the air, the wondering people beheld a peaceful plain studded with groups of large cotton trees, and plumed with thickets of oil and sago palms, their stems spotted white and scarlet with the flowers of the bindweeds that twined around them. And, set in fields of the purple-flowered indigo and white and red rice, stood a cluster of round clay huts, with their conical roofs thatched with the yellow leaves of the fan palm. In the distance twisted a broad river, through banks blushing with the blossoms of the almond and the cream fruit tree, while the neighboring hills were here grey with the barren granite, and their motley with the bloom of the sweet-smelling heaths and rock roses. And beneath the shade of the tamarind trees sat men, with their skins black as ebony, weaving many-colored rushes, while in the far-off fields, women, with their skins as black as those who wove, braved the scorching sun, though it cast no shadow of their figures along the ground, and tilled the parched earth or tended the herds of black cattle that waded through the long, thick grass. Presently were seen the white sails of a strange ship, slowly gliding up the stream. As it neared the village, a boat left it for the shore, and their white-faced men stepped from it, and went along the banks, beating big drums. Instantly, the skies grew red with the fires that blazed up in answer on the hilltops, telling the Christian crew that the human cargo they had come to buy was ready to be sold. Then, as Huan again waved his branch, the scene darkened with the shades of night, and, as all around grew black, the little windows of the hut shone yellow with the lights within. As the moon rose from behind the dusky mountains, and its beams fell in a silver shower on the peaked roofs, the lights vanished one by one from the windows, and the Negro village was hushed in slumber. Then, from the hilltops, a black flood of men came pouring down, their arms glittering white in the moonlight, led on by their half-clad king, eager for the human plunder. The treacherous band surrounded the sleeping village, so that none might escape, and, firing the huts, the scene grew light as day with the flames. Then men, women, and children were seen rushing, screaming, from their burning homes, and husbands and fathers hurried forth, spear in hand, to defend their wives and little ones, whilst others madly attacked their foes, preferring to lose their lives rather than outlive their liberty. Some of the villagers were seized and bound together with thongs, whilst others, escaping, fled towards the river, pursued by the ruthless robbers, and, plunging in, the moonlit waters were black over with their heads, as they swam for refuge to the Christian ship. As they breasted the stream, the white-faced crew cheered them on, inviting them to seek protection there. But, as some of the stranger seamen welcomed them and helped them gain the deck, others, immediately they set upon it, sprang, armed with cutlasses, upon the trusting blacks, and, dragging them below, cast them into bondage forever. Then, as the magic branch was again waved, the same village was seen lighted by the morning sun, the white smoke rising from the ruins that marked the spots where the huts had stood, while all around, in black and red masses, lay the slaughtered villagers. Then long canoes, well manned and armed, were seen sweeping through the tall mat rushes that flanked the neighboring creeks, and in the bottoms of the boats lay heaps of wretched captives, thrown one above another, with their hands and feet lashed with matting, while along the yellow path a cloud of dust was seen, and droves of manacled blacks moved slowly towards the ship, bound together at the neck with thongs of buffalo hide, but now they stopped to free the hand and neck of one who, spent with his sufferings, sank to the ground, and was left to die. And when the captive flock had all been herded together, the Christian strangers came from the ship, and walked up and down the human cattle fair, haggling with the heartless dealers, now giving a pistol or a keg of spirits in exchange for this man, and now a bar of wrought iron, a yard or two of printed cotton, and a few colored beads as the purchase money of that family. Then, as the black dealers returned from the fair, delighted with their gains, Huan showed the people how they grew greedy for more. Hurrying back to their own villages, some hid themselves in the forest, and, crouching in the underwood, watched beside the paths that ran from village to village, as a huntsman watches for his game, and, as the unsuspecting traveler strolled along, they sprang out and secured their prize. Others lurked in the tall weeds that grew near the springs, so that they might pounce upon those that came to quench their thirst. Some, more treacherous than these, proclaimed a feast, and regaled their simple, trusting friends with the spirits they had received from the Christian crew, and, when they had made the feasters helpless with the drink, they lashed their limbs together, and, carrying them to the huge factory, stored them there for a future sale. Others, made avaricious by their heartless gains, gambled madly among themselves for more, and, when they had lost all they had, they staked the freedom of their wives and children against a few bright blue beads, and, when these had gone too, in the frenzy of the game they wagered even their own liberty, and by an unlucky throw enslaved themselves, as they had enslaved their kindred, for life. Then, as the vision melted from the skies, Huan turned to the shuddering crowd, and, lifting up his hands, cried again, "Shall we say we love our brethren as ourselves, and still let these things be?" And the people one and all exclaimed, in answer, "No, they shall not be." Again Huan waved the magic branch, and again there was a mirage in the skies, and a vessel was seen taking in its live cargo. As the Negroes set foot upon the deck, the white men bound them together two and two, some by the neck, and others by the leg, with fetters of solid iron. While some of the crew were busy riveting the irons, others placed strong netting high up along the shrouds of the ship, so that none of the precious lives might be lost by the captives leaping overboard. As the slaves sat huddled together on the deck, about to leave their native land forever, and be torn from all that was dear to them, they watched eagerly for some means to end their hopeless days. Some, despite all the care, leapt with happy faces into the shark-infested stream, and immediately the waters were red with their blood. Others refused to eat, while the receivers stood over them with the food in one hand and the lash in the other. Still neither the threats nor even the whip itself could make the resolute wretches part their lips. Then live coals were brought, and pressed close against their mouths, but still the poor things held them fast. At length an iron instrument was used to wrench their jaws asunder, and liquids poured down their throats, to save the lives that were so dear to the Christians. Others again, driven mad by their sufferings, sat chained by the neck to the masts, or lay on their backs fastened to the deck of the vessel, and there they raved, now cursing their enslavers, and now breaking out into dismal songs, bewailing the loss of their friends and country, and thus to be kept till they either died in their ravings, or in a lucid interval were sold as sound. One, more desperate than the rest, as he sat chained to his fellow, seized a knife from the hand of a white man as he ate, and then, even fettered as he was, darted forward, and plunged it into the heart of his Christian enslaver. And the desperate wretch would have wreaked his vengeance on the rest, but, finding the partner of his chains afraid to follow him, he stabbed his black brother, as one unfit to live. Then, as the wind sprang up, the human cargo was forced down into the low, dark hold. And through the airy sides of the spectral slave ship the poor wretches were seen stowed as any other lumber, close as bales, so that even the room necessary to change their position and ease their cramped muscles might not be lost. Some lay on their backs, on ledges one above another, others sat cross-legged, there to be tossed and rolled about by the vessel, till, by the chafing of the boards, their very bones should work their way through the muscles and the skin. Then, as the vessel sailed away, there was seen the large fin of many a shark, made prescient by its hunger, cutting the waters in the wake. Again Huan waved his branch, and the ship was seen far away at sea. As the sun broke out from between the thick clouds, and shone on the wet decks, the glittering tarpaulins were taken from the hatches, and the gratings uncovered at last, after the long rain. As they were lifted off, the rank steam came reeking up from the hold like the vapor from a boiling pot, while the sailors stood back to avoid the blast that streamed forth, hot as from an oven. Then came the rabid rush and scream for air below, while all pressed forward to the light, to drink in the sweet cool breeze. Some were hindered by the partner of their chains lying dead beside them, and, though they strove, they lacked the power to drag him after them. Others, bruised and bleeding in the struggle, fainted, and were trampled underfoot by their stronger brethren. Then, as the black multitude were mustered on the deck, those that were sick and those that were dying were cast into the sea, so that the remainder of the human cargo might escape contagion, and the loss, by some crafty plea of necessity, be made to fall upon the Christian insurers rather than the Christian owners of the vessel. After this came the most fearful time of all. The sky was like a vault of lead, and the breast of the Petrel, as it whirled above the mast tops, shone with a double whiteness against the black clouds. The sea was like a vast waste of drifting snow, with the fury of restless waves, while the vessel, stripped of its masts, was driven before the hurricane like a leaf in the wind. As the waves smote the sides of the ship, she stopped for a minute, as if stunned, and quivered again with the blow, while the waters swept over the deck, covering the ship as with a shroud. Then the gratings were again battened down and sealed with the tarpaulin as if with the black seal of death, so that neither water nor even air could enter. Then the pumps were worked, but though the crew, one and all, labored at them with desperate energy, still the water in the hold gained upon them, while the hideous and piercing screams that rose from beneath the hatches told that the slaves were choking and drowning down below. Then the sky was lighted for a moment with the flash of the gun, that cried aloud in the wide waste of waters for help. At last a sail appeared in sight. As she bore down in answer to the signal of distress, the boats were lowered, and then the heartless Christian crew were seen to quit the sinking hull, and leave its wretched human freight, fast battened down, to the mercy of the boiling waves. Once more Huan asked the multitude whether such things should be, and once more they answered, "No, they shall not be." Again the branch was waved, and again the scene was changed. And the more fortunate ships that had braved the tempest rode at anchor securely in the distant bay. In the center of a large market on the shore were seen, penned, the less fortunate blacks that had not perished in the storm. Beside the fresh slaves exposed there for sale stood others, who had been long in servitude, and nearly all with their bodies scarred and maimed with the marks of the passion, despotism, or caprice of their late masters. Those that had come to buy walked round, and scanned the forms and felt the muscles of those that were for sale. And, as they picked out and paid for some father and husband that pleased them, the wife and children would cry aloud, and beg of the buyer to buy them too. And when the mother and little ones had begged in vain, and the time came for their separation forever, they would appeal for mercy by every sign and gesture, and cling so fast to the limbs of him they dearly loved, that the lash alone could sever them from their last embrace. And when the strong and hale had been sold, there came the small dealers to risk a trifle on the chance of the returning health of the sick, and these were sold to the highest bidder, and then sent home to be nursed and fatted up for a future sale, whilst those that were too weak and sickly for the boldest speculator to hazard anything upon were taken back again to the ship, either to be starved to death, or else, while still living, cast with the dead body of their companion in chains into the sea. Once more the scene was changed, and those that were taken home from the sale had their ears slit and their shoulders branded as a mark of the property of their Christian owners. After this, they were sent to the field to toil from the rising of the sun far into the night, badly clothed, miserably fed, their drudgery intense and incessant, their rest short, without a single law to protect their wrongs, without even a Sabbath to rest their wearied limbs, without the possibility of redress, without a hope that their situation would be bettered, unless, indeed, death should end their sufferings. For Huan showed the people that if, still worn with fatigue after their scanty sleep, the poor blacks came not to the field exactly at the appointed hour, if, drooping with sickness, they appeared to work unwillingly at the sugar-cane, or if the bundle of grass they had been collecting blade by blade, beneath the burning sun, seemed too small in the eye of their taskmaster, then the whip was sure to fall heavily on their backs, scoring their black skins, red at almost every stroke, so that the smack of it rang the whole day long in the ears of all that were near. Next was seen one who, sick at heart and weak with fatigue, fell down beneath his brethren. But the rattan was plied to raise him, and the poor spent slave staggered to his feet once more. A few steps further, and unequal to the task, he sank to the earth again. Then the savage taskmaster, enraged at what he thought the sullen spirit of the black, repeated his blows, as he swore to make him rise, and lashed, till the worn-out Negro expired at his feet. Then Huan showed them one poor soul, on whom the terrors of the whip had been exhausted, placed in an iron coffin pierced with holes, and set so near a fire, that the wretched inmate writhed and shrieked within. And, when he had died under the torture, and the officers came to claim the fine that Christian justice had imposed as a compensation for the wrong, the master gave them the sum, in value scarcely the purchase money of a horse, that the law had named as full and sufficient punishment for the murder of a black. After this, as the people groaned and shuddered at the wrongs, Huan showed them the last dreadful scene of all. A wilderness, dark with the thick-set trees, was seen. Presently, a Negro who had escaped from his overwhelming toil, and on whose head a price was set, darted by, his black skin whitened with the foam from his exertions, and looking back in fear, as he threaded in and out the trees. When he had gone, there came two bloodhounds, with their noses to the ground, sniffing for the human scent they knew so well, and after them a huntsman, mounted on his horse, with his rifle ready cocked in his hand. And, when these had passed, there was seen in the darkness of the distant with the bright flash of a gun. Then the scene was changed once more, and men sat drinking in a tavern. As they laughed and joked, the door was flung suddenly back, and the same huntsman entered, with the same bloodhounds whining and jumping up about him. Advancing to the table where the drinkers sat, the huntsman dashed down among the wine cups the bleeding head of the runaway slave, and demanded of one of the revelers the price that he had set upon it. Now, when Huan had shown these scenes to the people, he cried a third time, "Shall we say we love our neighbors as ourselves, and still let these things be?" And a third time the people answered, "No, they shall not be." Then Huan said, "It is for you to break the chains that bind these wretched men, it is for you to stop the stealing and the slaying of your dark-skinned brethren. Let each give his mite." Instantly all with one accord threw down their little offering, and the golden heap grew and grew, until the people's bounty numbered twice 10,000,000 pieces. Then the whip ceased, and the cries were hushed, and the mother shrieked no more. And there was a vision in the skies of a rude temple by night, where knelt the grateful Negroes, with the yellow light streaming down and tinting their black faces, and their upturned eyes shining white as large pearls, while their hands were clasped, as he who had been their only friend taught them to speak the homely prayer they longed but lacked the skill to utter. And, as their prayers went up to heaven, the golden finger of the dial crept slowly on, until it marked the hour of midnight. Then, as the bells chimed forth the long-looked-for time, telling them the first moment of their precious liberty had at last arrived, the voice of the preacher friend was heard crying in the still wide depth of the night, "Slaves, you are free." In a moment there burst forth from a million throats one long, loud, lusty cheer, and there was a scream of wild joy, and the sky flashed crimson with the red flames of the fires of a mighty jubilee. Then came floating on the night breeze the hymn of thanksgiving, sung by 1,000 grateful voices. But, louder than the mighty music of unlooked-for liberty, was heard the sound of trumpets in the heavens above, heralding the wondrous kindness of the deed, till the whole world rang with the glory of it, and other tribes woke up with the far-sounding praise, and stood aghast at the unparalleled charity of the act. Chapter 24. Governed by Huan's counsels, the people of Asulan lived in peace, happiness, and plenty, and all loved the dwarf but Aleph, who was still angry that his foster brother should have been set over him. Ulfilas in his old age rejoiced in the comforts and amity of his subjects, and his rule was that of a good father over a loving family. For the old warrior, softened by the teachings of the dwarf, grew to be so compassionate to those in want and under misfortune, that he would feed daily multitudes of poor people at his table, in whatever part of the kingdom he might be. Ofttimes he would serve them himself, and from his own table, even before he had eaten or drunk, and, when fed, he would send them to their homes, each with a certain sum, so that the money he gave away in alms could not be told or counted. And, when some of his household murmured at his great gifts, the good king would reply, that he would rather spend his revenue in charity than in follies and vanity. Anthe dwelt with Evoi, and each shared her blessings with the other, so that the afflictions of the two were felt by neither, and they visited the poor and the sick together, for Evoi, with her eyes would seek out the suffering, while Anthe with her voice would comfort and counsel them. And so year after year came and went in joy and friendship, until at last Ulfilas, spent with old age, was stricken down like one fatigued with a long journey. In the midst of his life's struggles, the good old king looked at death as the patriarch of old looked at the dove that brought him the fresh-plucked olive leaf, to tell him that the storm was abating and peace was at hand. Then, as he felt his life stream ebbing fast, he called Huan and his children round him, and besought the dwarf, as a last request, that he would reign over his people until such time as the hot blood of his son Aleph should have cooled with growing age, and fitted him to learn and love the kindly principles that had made the kingdom so tranquil and so happy. Huan prayed the dying monarch that he would unsay his words, and begged Ulfilas to let him guide instead of led, promising that he would serve the son as faithfully as he had served the father. But Ulfilas saw Aleph's brow darken with jealousy of Huan, and he said, as he panted for breath, "Nay, my son, be not angry with thy country's truest friend. I alone am to blame. Had I not trained thee to love conquest, thou mightest now have been fit to rule over a people loving peace. Go, unlearn with Huan all that thou didst learn from me, and, when thou canst find more glory in bearing blows than in returning them, then ask of him the crown that I here make over to him in trust for thee." Again Huan besought the king to give his son his birthright, and let him be the prince's friend rather than the prince's stumbling block. But the dying Ulfilas rebuked Huan, telling him it was unjust to hesitate between the ambition of one and the happiness of so many. And he made the dwarf promise he would not turn a deaf ear to his last request. Then the good old king blessed the sorrowing Evoi and the sullen Aleph, and, as he spake the kindly words, the thin hand fell powerless and the trembling voice was hushed, and then the spent spirit floated back with a sigh to its mighty home, like a wave rippling on a vast shore. Chapter 25. Now when it became known to the neighboring nations that the warrior Ulfilas was dead, and the passive dwarf had been proclaimed king of Asulan, the foreign chieftains rose in arms, crying, "The sword of him we feared rests by his side in the grave. The tribute that he and his people forced from us we will now force back from them." So they gathered their armies together, and declared war against the worshippers of the olive branch. Soon the shepherds came flying from the distant plains to the city of Asulan, telling how a mighty host was sweeping over the land like a plague of locusts, covering the face of the earth, and destroying all that fell in their way. Then the frighted people, stirred up by the jealous Aleph, called upon Huan the king to prepare for defense against their invaders, saying, "The principle of kindness is good for individuals, but not for nations, For, if we resist not evil now that an armed host is coming to sack our town, our homes will be burnt, and our wives and children massacred, by the enemies we are told to love. But Huan upbraided them for their want of faith, telling them, if those that came to fight found none to fight with, there could be no fighting on either side, for that men did not go out with axes to cut reeds, nor did they hurl their javelins at shadows. The wall of stone, he said, could not stand against the ball poured from the cannon's mouth, and yet the bag of sand could stay its course. What, he asked them, was so weak as water? Did it not yield even to the breeze? And yet, by its very yielding, it gained a force that even the rocks themselves could not withstand. But Aleph laughed scornfully at the words of the dwarf, and in mockery bade the people go home and make ready their little all, so that those who came to plunder might return laden with the easy spoil, and, scoffing at the craven crew that gave it them, tell others to come and take their fill also. And those who were as young and impassioned as Aleph listened to his words, and cried in answer, "It is well to be kind, but it is base to be cowardly. Though we would not be heroes, finding our greatest glory in the slaughter of the greatest number, still, do not let us become dogs, to lick the hand that smites us." Then Aleph, finding a spirit of discontent growing up among the youths of the city, gathered them around him, and became their leader. And they rose in the night, and, surrounding the palace, seized upon Huan and all those that sided with him. And, when they had cast the dwarf into prison, Aleph was proclaimed king in his stead. Then the warrior youth summoned together again the troops that he had so often led on to conquest, and prepared once more for battle. But the people still looked upon Huan as one beloved by God, and feared to draw the sword unless he blessed the banners they were to fight under. So Aleph sought out Huan in his dungeon, and spake kindly to him, promising him his liberty if he would but consecrate the banners of the troops. But the dwarf answered, "Ye have set the olive branch upon them, and made the symbol of peace the emblem of war. Verily, to implore a blessing on the one is to invoke a curse upon the other." Presently news was brought to the city that the enemy were within a few days' march of Asulan, and the citizens grew alarmed, and again cried aloud for the blessing of the dwarf. Then Aleph, knowing the superstition of the multitude, feared to lead the people on without Huan's bedizen. So he gathered together his troops, and summoning the dwarf from his dungeon, bade him, in the presence of the assembled army, invoke a blessing on the banners, threatening him with death if he withheld it. But Huan asked the royal youth by what form of words he should call upon the compassionate, the merciful, to pour down his grace upon the banners of death? Or by what blasphemy he should invoke the spirit of kindness to bless and make holy the flag of slaughter? Now when Aleph heard the rebuke, he shook with anger, and the army grew furious, crying, "Away with him to the lion's den! Away with him!" Then the unresisting Huan was seized and dragged to the valley beyond the city walls. And, while some set a rude barrier round about the meadow, others hurried to bring the cage of the roaring monster, and when they had dragged it thither they placed it in the center of the field. A third time Aleph asked the dwarf whether he would bless the banners. For the third time Huan refused, saying he was the minister of kindness. And Aleph, crimson with passion at the man's stubbornness, cried, "Cast him in. Let us see how this kindness will avail him with raging lions." Then Huan was thrust within the arena, and the savage monster let loose upon him, while the crowd climbed the neighboring hills, and stood breathless with suspense, as they gazed down upon the plain. The huge lion sprang from his den, and bounded towards Huan, who stood wrapped in prayer. But no sooner was the eye of the creature fixed upon the dwarf, than the black-maned beast crouched at his feet, and, as it rolled on its back, turned up its white stomach to be fondled by him. Then Huan recognized in the grateful brute the creature whom he had freed of the thorn, and, as he placed his foot upon the lion's side, it rolled backwards and forwards in the dust, as it whined out again and again its noisy gratitude. As the people remained silent with wonder at the sight, Huan turned to Aleph, and, as he looked upon him, cried aloud, "See you now how kindness availeth a man, even with raging lions." Then the mob, in answer, cried, "Verily he is a spirit from heaven, even the beasts of the field fear to injure him." But the troops shouted, "He is a demon, and governs lions as well as men. To the stake with him! To the stake!" In a moment the soldiers rushed down into the arena and, with their spears, slew the noble, harmless brute, as he yet crouched at the dwarf's feet. Then, forcing back the relenting mob, some drove a stake into the earth, while others, with eager hands, cut faggots from the neighboring woods. Then, as they led him to the stake, some spat upon him, whilst others, snatching the olive branch from him, smote him with it in the face, crying, "Wilt thou bless the banners now?" But Huan held out his hand in friendship to those that struck him, saying, "Nay, brothers, I am a man of peace." Huan's firmness they called obstinacy, and, growing only more savage with each fresh refusal, they bethought them by what cruel torture they could wring the blessing from him. Then, as they saw the blind girl still by Alep's side, imploring him by every tie that had ever been between them to look with mercy on her brother, they rushed towards her, and, before the prince could stay the savage spirit that he had roused and fostered till it had grown beyond his control, they bore her down to the death stake of her brother, and, placing a lighted torch in her hand, vowed that, unless the dwarf gave the blessing they sought, his own sister should be his executioner. Huan, seeing Anthe pale and powerless with horror at the threat, ran towards her, and, kissing her on the cheek, said, "Be of good heart, sister. And play the woman, for God will either assuage the fury of the flame, or strengthen me to bear it." Then, as they chained him, he again exhorted the fainting girl, crying, "Be of good comfort, sister Anthe, we shall this day light such a fire, by God's grace, in Asulon as I trust never shall be put out." As Anthe fell back senseless, the soldiers held the lighted torch within her lifeless hand, and stretched her unresisting arm towards the faggots. And, before the repenting Aleph could reach the plain, the flames were curling round about the unconscious dwarf, as at his death he prayed for, what in his life he had preached, the forgiveness of his enemies. As Huan spake the kindly words, and looked up in prayer, he saw, as when he slept in the cave, the same dazzling light streaming down from heaven, and the same golden clouds resting on the green fields, and piled one above another, till the topmost was lost in the amazing splendor of the skies. And the same white-winged host of angels mounted them as before, chanting the glory of the kindly words, and beckoning him to follow them. The angel band melted one by one from his sight, and the last stood again on the topmost cloud of all. And she looked back once more, and once more beckoned him to follow her. As she gazed at him, she looked upon him so tenderly from out her tearful eyes, and smiled upon him with so compassionate a smile, that Huan knew it was the spirit of kindness that still showed him the way to heaven. And, as his soul struggled to be gone, the people beheld rise from out the ashes of the fire an angel form, winging its way to the realms of endless peace. Then the repentant multitude fell on their knees, and bowed their heads to the earth in worship, as they saw, the last and greatest magic change of all, the spirit of kindness changed the man into the angel. And the hearts of the people were turned to gentleness, and they one and all cast their spears and swords and arrows into the fire, vowing by the ashes of him they had murdered that, henceforth, only with kindly words would they turn away wrath. Aleph stood for a while, beating his breast with remorse, then, throwing himself upon Eve's neck, the tears gushed, for the first time, down the young warrior's cheek, as he thought of the many wrongs he had done the dwarf and his gentle sister. And he prayed Evoe that she would take the senseless Anthe from the field, while she was yet unconscious of her brother's fate, and so spare him the bitter rebuke of her forgiveness, until he knew that the kindly spirit he had destroyed had entered his own soul, and, by doing as her brother would have done, had shown Anthe, both by his love and his acts, that her brother still lived in himself. Chapter 26. Each citizen, at Aleph's bidding, returned to his home, and when news was brought him that the enemy was in sight, Aleph bade them all go to their work, as though they cared not for the coming. So, when the armed foes poured down upon the city, they found the ramparts deserted and the gates open. And as they entered in hostile array, their trumpets sounding defiance, and their swords ready to repel the citizens, they looked round for the troops, and they saw the husbandman at his plough, and the shepherd tending his flock, and they heard the blacksmith busy at his anvil, and the peasant girl at her churn, whilst old women sat in the sunshine, plying the spinning wheel, or with their children's children at their feet, threading the needle for them. And, as the soldiers paced along, the weaver stopped his loom, and peeped from his window for a minute at the show, and then plied the shuttle as before. The laborer rested on his spade for a while, and then, turning from the sight, dug on again, and the water carrier stopped on his rounds to offer to the tired troops a draught of cool drink from the skins he bore. Mothers brought out their babes to hear the music, while housewives stood at their doors with plates of fruit and sweetmeats wherewith to feast the wearied enemies. Girls ran out to see the pretty flags and glittering armor, and boys marched fearlessly by the side of the hostile troops, in mimic rank and file. As the amazed enemy tramped along, they asked of the heedless passers-by, "Where are your soldiers?" "We have none," was the answer, "but we have come to take the town." They cried, "Well, friends, it lies before you, take it," was the calm reply. "Is there no one to defend it? No one to fight?" inquired the leader. "No one. We live in peace here with all men," returned the careless passengers, and moved on. And when the army had reached the palace, Aleph himself came forth to meet and welcome them. Again they cried, "We come to take your town. Is there nobody that thinks it worth the fighting for?" But still the answer was, "No, we live in peace here with all men." Then the chieftains were perplexed, and they cried, "If there is nobody to fight with, verily there can be no fighting." And the people looked with wonder at one another, for they remembered the prophetic words of the martyr dwarf. Then Aleph, seeing the abashed army about to depart, besought them that they would enter and rest their tired limbs, and break bread, ere they went their way. So the armed host, finding themselves received as friends, refused to act as enemies, and they remained for a while as the welcome guests of those whose town they had come to sack and pillage. And when the invading host had left, Aleph swore an oath never again to raise his hand in war or anger against his fellow man, now that he had learnt that the kiss was a mightier weapon than the blow. Then he sought out Anthe, and throwing himself at her feet, begged of her, by the charity of the creed that Huan had taught them all, and he, alas, had learned too late, to forgive and love him, her bitterest enemy. And he wept as though his heart would break. Anthe bade him rise, saying, she forgave him, as she hoped to be herself forgiven, and she promised him, moreover, that the struggle of her life should be to love him too. For if ever she could force herself to look with affection on him again, then she would know, she said, how truly the spirit within her had triumphed over the promptings of the flesh. And Aleph besought her that she would remain with Evoe and be ever near, to watch over him, so that by her sweet counseling she might strengthen him, in the kindly creed, and teach him, even in his angry moments, to have faith in the spirit of kindness.